Welcome to Just Energy Radio with your host, naturopath and medical intuitive, Dr. Rita Louise. We have learned from Einstein's theory that matter and energy are one. Physicists believe that all systems in nature have their own particular way of vibrating. From the swinging of a pendulum to the waves of the ocean to the light that brightens the sky each day, each of these oscillates at its own unique rate. The same holds true for every thought, feeling, event, or word we speak. Each has its own frequency or rate of vibration. What many of us don't realize is when we take everything in our universe down to its simplest form, it is all just energy. Join Dr. Rita Louise on a journey through time and space where past, present, and future collide. Today, what you believe may be called into question. What we want to know is, who made up the rules? Be brave and step outside the box. We are about to turn our world upside down and venture into the unknown. Hold on. We are departing our own beliefs and entering alternative realms. Enjoy the possibilities.
Hello and welcome to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for tuning into the show today. Yet another wonderful episode. This week we're going to be speaking to Robert Feather about one of my favorite topics, Moses. And we're going to be talking about his new book, Where Moses Stood. Just Energy Radio is brought to you by soulhealer.com, where you can find out about all the products and services I offer, including medical intuition evaluations, energy healing, and psychic readings. So if there's stuff going on in your life, give me a call, send me an email, and we can set up a time for a private consultation wherever you are in the world. It's also brought to you by the Institute of Applied Energetics. That's www.appliedenergeticsinstitute.com, where you can learn to become a medical intuitive from the comfort of your own home. If you want, you can visit the site and download their free Jumpstart Your Intuition program, where you can open the door to a new career and a new you. If you haven't downloaded your copy of Icon, Deconstructing the Archetypes of the Ancients, it's available for digital download on Amazon.com, $1.99. And you learn all about parallels in art and architecture that we find around the world. It really is a fascinating subject. Or you can get the actual DVD from the soulhealer.com site, and we have some special offers going on right now. So please check it out, soulhealer.com. Icon, Deconstructing the Archetypes of the Ancients. Let me tell you a little bit about Robert Feather and bring him on the air. Robert Feather is a metallurgist, engineer, journalist, and scholar of world religions. Throughout his time, he has balanced his scientific career with a keen interest in history and social evolution, studying comparative religions and archaeology. He is a member of the Orion Center for Study of the Dead Sea Scrolls and Associated Literature, the Society of Biblical Literature, the Egypt Exploration Society, and the Historical Metallurgy Society. His background and training as a metallurgist and chartered engineer has given him a unique insight into the intricacies of the Copper Scrolls, one of the most enigmatic of the Dead Sea Scrolls. This has resulted in him being retained as a consultant on a number of projects related to ancient metallic objects. His webpage is robert-feather.com. Please welcome the author of Where Moses Stood, Robert Feather. Hey, Robert, how are you?
Dr. Rita, I'm very, very well and so pleased to speak to you again.
I am just so happy that I get to have you back on. You have a new book. It's so and it's Moses. Oh, that's like, the trifecta right there.
Uh-huh. Well, the last time we spoke was in December 2012, when I talked about new insights on the Dead Sea Scrolls. I think I just completed a book called Black Holes in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where I was sort of looking at all the inadequacies in the current understanding of the Dead Sea Scroll material and their impact on the Bible. And that probably gets us a good sort of introduction into where we're going tonight. Initially, we're going into Egypt via the Copper Scroll and via another book that I wrote about Jesus. And then we're coming out again. We've got to get out of Egypt somehow.
Okay. And that, I think, is a great place to start, because if I recall correctly, it was in, I don't remember which interview, you had just finished your work on the Copper Scrolls, and we actually spent part of the interview talking about them and about and I don't have that information right at the top of my head, but I recall you talking about that you actually believed that the Copper Scroll was created in Egypt, and that there were some clues in the scroll that led you to believe that. And maybe that would be a great place to start.
Okay. It's really because I trained as a metallurgist that I got interested in the Copper Scroll. It's quite unique. It's 99.9% pure copper. It was probably inscribed at Qumran by the Dead Sea, by this community, which generally referred to as Essenes, although they never called themselves that. And one of their scrolls amongst, literally hundreds of scrolls, about 900 different scrolls, all some complete and some tiny fragments, was this copper scroll, which was found in 1952 in Cave 3 at Qumran. And it was literally a list of buried treasure, amounting to fabulous amounts of gold and silver and jewelry and other precious material. And within the 64 locations that are described were Greek letters interspersed in the Hebrew text. Most of the script itself was an ancient form of Hebrew, period of the sort of second temple period, round about the time of Jesus. And this community is considered to have been at Qumran from about 140 BC up to 68 CE, when their community was destroyed by the Romans. And the Copper Scroll was quite unique in it doesn't fit into any of the other sort of categories of scriptural biblical texts, the sectarian texts describing the community's activities, and the kind of apocryphal and pseudepigraphic material. This is just a one-off. And when I started looking at it from a metallurgical point of view, I was just quite surprised at how little work had been done on the actual technology of the material. And I came to the conclusion that there were a lot of things were wrong in the understanding of it. And within the text, there were 14 Greek letters, almost randomly scattered in groups of 2 or 3 letters. And no one quite knew what they were. I took the first 10 letters and put them together, and I read them as Akhenaten. And that was just mind-blowing. What was the name of an Egyptian pharaoh from the 18th dynasty, 14th century BCE, doing in a Jewish document in Canaan, in Israel? It just didn't seem to be credible, but it was. I mean, when I talked to other scholars about it, their initial reaction was, "Wow, this is incredible." Particularly, Professor George Brooke, who'd been a mentor of mine and encouraged me, his initial reaction was, "You cracked the code that people have been trying to understand for years." He subsequently backtracked on that view, probably because, like a lot of other scholars, he got nervous about what the implications of this name were in the scroll. And he said, "Well, Robert, you've got to go away and prove that that could be a plausible reading of these 10 Greek letters that you put together and read as Akhenaten." So I went to Professor John Tate at University College. I went to, she was Dr. Rosalie David at the time. She's now a professor at Manchester University. And they both looked at it and said, yeah, they were experts in Greek and hieroglyphics, which most scholars aren't. Certainly not the ones looking at the Dead Sea Scroll material.
Mm-hmm.
And they both said it's very plausible reading, and it well could be Akhenaten. And that led me on a path towards Egypt.
Well, what implications, what were people doing? You said that there was this treasure map kind of thing on the scroll. Has anybody found the treasure? And if they've been looking for the treasure, would it make the difference that they're using a starting point of like Jerusalem to try to ferret it out versus possibly starting in Egypt to look for it?
Absolutely. No. What you're saying is on the ball. The scroll was discovered in 1952, and it was opened in Manchester College of Science and Technology in 1955 and 1956. So it was then very readable and translated in about 1960 by Joseph Millick and John Allegro. But no one really understood. There were a lot of terms, particularly architectural terms and words that have not been seen before, and some forms of ancient Hebrew as well, which was harking back to the 8th century BC, sort of probably 700 years before the scroll was inscribed at Qumran.
Robert, where I think we left off was you were talking about the name Akhenaten appearing on the copper scroll. And so let's just kind of jump ahead because, you know, our topic is Moses. How does Moses tie in with, I mean, obviously Moses came out of Egypt, but what is the tie between Moses and Akhenaten?
That's an interesting question because if you look at a lot of the comments from other people, they connect Akhenaten to Moses. Some associate him with Akhenaten. Some make him Moses actually Akhenaten, which I have great difficulty with. I know
that was one of my questions I was going to ask you. Was I've had people state that Moses was Akhenaten, and the reason they haven't found his body was Akhenaten's body was because he was Moses and he left Egypt, and that was how the religion came to an end. And I don't know. I have a little bit of a problem with that one myself.
Well, I do too, actually. And Sigmund Freud, who was one of the earliest people, although Manito in the 4th century, an Egyptian priest, said that Moses was Akhenaten, but that just doesn't work. And Sigmund Freud wrote a book, Moses and Monotheism, in 1939, and he associated the Hebrew religion with Akhenaten, but he had Moses being at the time of Akhenaten, which is sort of about 1350 BC. But he didn't make Moses actually Akhenaten. Some other people like Ahmed Osman and I think Gary Greenberg. Gary Greenberg associates Moses with Akhenaten. He doesn't actually make him Akhenaten, but Ahmed Moses does. He equates them as being the same people, but they just cannot be. There's a chronological problem with that. Because Akhenaten dies, we know, we may not have found his body, but he certainly disappeared from Egyptian records completely in about 1350. Now, we know that the Exodus, the latest scholarship on the Exodus, dates it to coming into the Promised Land round about 1200. So that's a gap of 150 years, which is far too long for Moses, if Akhenaten was Moses, which is not. or if Moses came out of Egypt in 1350, which he didn't. I think Moses is about 50 or 60 years after Akhenaten disappears, in the reign of Ramses II. And all the current research shows that the Exodus started around about the time of 1260, 1270 in the reign of Ramses II, and they arrived at the Promised Land, Canaan, around about 1200. And there are key markers on that chronology which make it pretty firm and certain now. One is the presence of what can only have been the Israelites that were remaining in Egypt after Akhenaten died, and Joseph as his vizier, not anyone. Hello?
No, that's somebody calling me up.
Okay.
During showtime.
So it cannot be that Moses was Akhenaten, because he would have had to have lived about 150 years, which is impossible, unless you believe, fundamentally in the biblical story. So Moses has to be in Egypt at the time of Ramses II, who's almost certainly the Pharaoh of the oppression. But then we get the Merneptah Stela, which is very accurately dated to 1207. It's the first mention of Israel in history. That's in the Cairo Museum. And that's shortly before the Israelites get into the Promised Land. So anyone who thinks Akhenaten was Moses is wrong. Anyone who thinks Moses was associated at the period of Akhenaten, the Amarna period, is also wrong. Moses has to be 50 or 60 years after Akhenaten. And there are really strong links at the beginning and from my work in the middle, in transit through Sinai, and in the arrival in the Promised Land of Canaan. And those
let me ask you this question, Robert. You made a comment that they pretty much know when they arrived in Canaan. Is that a true statement?
Yes, I think it's a pretty strong statement. I mean, all the latest archaeological and literary work has shown that the hill country of Canaan experienced an influx of something like 60 to 70,000 new entrants into the country. And they weren't Canaanites who suddenly became Israelites. They came from outside. And we know that because of the kind of houses that they built when they arrived, the kind of terracing that they used, which was typical of Egyptian type of terracing. They built four-room houses, which are quite unique to Canaan. The Canaanites weren't using four-roomed houses. There's absence of pig bones, which is a characteristic of Israelites. And those four-roomed houses were found at the Delta region near Ramses, near Pi-Ramses, by Manfred Beitak and other archaeologists. And they're the same in Egypt as in Canaan. And they weren't there after the period of about 1240, 1250. So the Israelites had left. Their four-roomed houses they'd been living in and building no longer were being built, but they suddenly, or at least 40 years later, start appearing in the hill country of Canaan. So it's pretty irrevocable, but it's the same people bringing along the same construction technology into what what was the promised land for them, or we call it the promised land. So there was an influx of new immigrants into Canaan around about 1200 BC. So that's why we know that date. We also know it because of the Merneptah Stela, which is dated to 1207, and mentions Israel as being vanquished or defeated in some kind of encounter with the Pharaoh, with these Israelites. The hieroglyphic word reads Yisrael, and the determinative in front of the word Yisrael in the Merneptah Stela is a man and a woman, which is indicating that the name Yisrael is a people in transit with no fixed place. So he clearly has an encounter, just as the Bible describes, with a group in transit. He also talks about destroying Ashkelon, Gaza, and Yanoam. But when he talks about destroying those places in Canaan, and they're cities or places we know have been excavated and identified in Canaan, when the Merneptah Stela talks about those places, the determinative is a sort of a circle with a cross in it, and that means a fixed place. So they're a location. But when the Stela is talking about the people that are being destroyed, they're in transit. And Merneptah was Ramses II's son, and he almost certainly was the pharaoh of the pursuit. Ramses II is the pharaoh of the oppression, but Merneptah is the pharaoh of the pursuit.
Interesting. How does this tie into, because there are a lot of people that talk about the Jews Israel leaving Egypt with the Hyksos expulsion, or are we talking about the same thing, or are we talking about two different groups actually leaving Egypt?
No, I mean the Hyksos are an entirely different group. They were Canaanites, but they're much earlier. They're in before the New Kingdom period, before 1550, in the 16th century. So they're about 250 years before the Moses Exodus, if you want to call it that, which started under Ramses II, but was completed under Merneptah, his son. Ramses dies around about 1235, something like that, and Merneptah becomes the pharaoh. And this is the intriguing thing. We don't have Akhenaten's body. That's never been discovered. His sarcophagus has been reconstructed, and it's outside the Cairo Museum, with indications of the Aten sun's rays on it. So we know it was almost certainly a coffin prepared for him, but no body has ever been found. But we do have the body of Merneptah, mummified body of Pharaoh Merneptah, who I maintain is the pharaoh who pursued the Israelites as they left the Delta region, crossed Sinai, and came into the Promised Land, a period of something like 40 years, and they arrive at about 1200, so they're leaving at about 40 years before that, about 1240 BCE. We have the mummified body of Merneptah, and it's very peculiar. If you go to the mummy room in the Cairo Museum, I don't know if you've ever been to the Cairo Museum. Have you?
I have. No.
Oh, you must. Most of the mummies you see there, and mummies in other museums around the world, are very dark. The surface skin of the mummies are very black sometimes, but the mummy of Merneptah is white. It's very white. It's encrusted with salt. And recent studies by Professor Maurice Bucaille, who did an autopsy on Merneptah's body, he found evidence of salt water in his lungs, and that he died from drowning. And that's exactly as the Bible describes. It actually confirms the biblical story. I mean, I don't believe in the Bible literally every single word, but I think it's a very good guide for a lot of things that happened.
And I agree. All right, let me clarify something, because you said Meneptah was the one that was in pursuit, and it's sounding like, when Moses separated the Black Sea, he was the one that went in after him. But was that
the Bible talks about the Red Sea,
Black Sea, that colored sea, whichever one, the green sea.
I knew what you meant. But in fact,
if you didn't say anything, no one would even know the difference.
No, when people talk about the parting of the Red Sea and the crossing over, that is a mistranslation of the Hebrew. The Hebrew says Yom Sef, which is not Red Sea, it's Sea of Reeds, which is entirely different. And that makes a lot of sense, because coming out of the Delta region, there are very swampy, reedy, marshy areas. And that is almost certainly what must have happened. They left from near Pi Ramses in the Delta region, and the Pharaoh of the pursuit, Akhenaten, came after them in chariots.
But Ramses was still alive? And
no, Ramses has died now.
But see, this is where I'm getting a little bit confused. So did Ramses let his people go, or was it his son? Or was it his son that actually ended up letting them go?
No, Ramses let them go. You have to read in between the lines in the Bible, and you have to take it with a large dollop of sand, because it's embellished, it's exaggerated, and the details are blurred. But the essential core of it is true. So Meneptah, when the Bible says the Hebrews escaped or got out from Egypt, I think what happened was more likely that Moses, who was a prince of Egypt, very wealthy in his own right, a military leader, he bought their freedom. In fact, the Bible talks about him ransoming the children of Israel. I think he buys their freedom. The story about them being released because of the plagues, I think, again, is another fable. When you look at the 10 plagues, I don't think any of them actually happened. They are all taken from Egyptian experience of disasters that struck at various times, and the main one that is picked up on by whoever wrote the stories up in the Hebrew Bible alighted on something called the Ipuwer papyrus. And that's a papyrus that we have. It's in Holland. It's dated to about the 13th century BC. And it describes all sorts of disasters that resulted from what must have certainly happened around about 1620, when Santorini, or what it's now called Santorini, it was then called the island of Terra, experienced a huge volcanic explosion. And large areas of the Middle East were covered in the fallout and debris from this volcanic eruption. And all the plagues that hit Egypt at that time are described in the Bible. But that was something like 400 years before the children of Israel left Egypt. What happened, I think, is that the biblical writers looked around to see what can they come up with to explain how the Israelites came out, and these plagues were known to them. So they said, well, that is a good explanation of how God, and this was demonstrating a principle that appears in many, many biblical texts. God is more powerful than the most powerful ruler in the known world, the Pharaoh of Egypt. And he's brought to his knees by a series of plagues, but plagues that never actually happened. They're just stories that they knew about and they utilized to demonstrate the point that God brought them out of Egypt by threatening the Pharaoh with these plagues. And the upside of that is the worst of these plagues, the killing of the firstborn, which is described in the papyrus as a consequence of the eruption of this volcano. It actually says in part 4 of the papyrus that the children of the throat, which is babies held against the mother's breast, they were dashed against the wall by the storms and floods that occurred because of this volcano. So the killing of the firstborn never happened. Never happened. It's just taken from Egyptian mythology. Well, not legend of events that actually happened in Egypt. So,
but doesn't that happen all the time in mythic literature, where they don't have enough details to kind of tell the story, so they borrow something from somewhere else and kind of slide it in to make the story better? Absolutely,
and you know, that's why things like the huge empires that Solomon is supposed to have had. I mean, this is where we run up. There are a lot of people who don't believe the Exodus even happened. They don't believe Moses existed, but that is nonsense. He did exist, and one of the reasons they say is, well, we know nothing about the period of the monarchs, which is King Saul, King David, and King Solomon, around about, say, 1000 BC, that kind of period, down to about 900 and something, those three kings. They say there's no archaeological evidence for any of those, and they are actually probably right. There is no evidence at all archaeologically for those three kings, and the Bible describes them as of having huge empires stretching from here to the Euphrates. I mean, that just didn't happen. That was all glorification of the new kingdom, if you like, that did exist after, in the divided monarchy period in about 800 BC. But before that, no. It's just, they may have been tribal chiefs, but they certainly weren't kings with huge empire. As you rightly say, they embellished it enormously. And a lot of skeptics say, well, because that period is just fiction, then everything before must be fiction. That's not true, because we've got a gap in the history. Doesn't mean that the Exodus didn't take place, that Moses wasn't a real person, that Joseph and Jacob weren't real people. They were. And in my previous books, I've shown pretty well conclusively there is inscriptional evidence for Joseph and Jacob at Amarna, the capital city of Akhenaten. So there are other reasons why they doubt the Exodus, but we can discuss those, if you want to, a little in more detail when we get out of Egypt and across into Sinai.
Okay. You made a comment that Moses was an Egyptian prince. Are you saying he was an Egyptian prince because he was, you know, as the story goes, pulled out of the water and raised in the court? Or are you stipulating that he was actually really Egyptian?
He was Egyptian, yes. I'm an Egyptian of the royal family, yes. I mean, this pulling out of the Nile. I mean, what Jewish mother is going to leave her baby in a basket in the middle of nowhere? It's most unlikely. That is another story which you can see from other Babylonian myths and other myths. It's just used to try and explain why he, as an Egyptian prince, is actually Hebrew, which he wasn't. And things like him having to have someone to translate for him because he stuttered when he speaks to Pharaoh is just an excuse for the fact that as a Hebrew, he wouldn't have been able to speak to Pharaoh, but Moses, as an Egyptian, could. So we've got him coming out of Egypt, and it's a little bit complicated, and this is one of the things that Freud had a problem with. He said, well, if Moses is associated with the Pharaoh Akhenaten, how come he became the leader of the Hebrews, of the Hebrews? Because they would have been despised, a foreign group within the country. An Egyptian would not have adopted Hebrews.
Yeah, that's a great question. Why would he take the Hebrews under his wing?
Well, very, very briefly, my contention is that Joseph was the vizier of Akhenaten, and Jacob was his father, and brought the tribe to Egypt because of famine. And the Bible actually says that Jacob became a bosom friend of the Pharaoh. It never names the Pharaoh, but that Pharaoh is Akhenaten, in my view. And there's inscriptional evidence and archaeological evidence to prove that at Amarna. When Jacob dies, the Pharaoh gives him a funeral cortege out of Egypt and honors him. Akhenaten rules for about 17 years. He comes to the throne at about the age of 16, so he dies at the age of about 35. When he dies, or is murdered almost certainly, Jacob is dead already, but Joseph and the other tribe, the brothers who are going to be the leaders of the 12 tribes, plus his children, Ephraim and Manasseh, they have prospered and multiplied. But now their benefactor, Pharaoh Akhenaten, is gone, and they're left stranded, and they then become taken into slavery. Now then, for the next 40 or 50 years, they're in servitude. They're because Akhenaten becomes a despised name. They chisel out all his attempts to introduce one God and try and turn Egypt back into idolatry. So these family of Joseph and those other followers of the one God, the Aten, are prescribed people. They're persona non grata. I think you latched onto that phrase once before. And what happens, Moses comes along as a prince of Egypt. He's educated at On, Heliopolis, and there he learns about one God. He learns about Akhenaten's revolutionary idea of one invisible, all-powerful God. And he likes it. And then he discovers that there's a group, the Hebrews, who also believe in one God, because they were present when, or at least their predecessors, were present when Akhenaten enunciated this philosophy. So Moses adopts them as his people. He says, these people... Sorry, yes.
Let me ask you this question. Do you think that the Akhenaten influenced the beliefs of the Jewish people and made them be monotheistic? Or do you think that Joseph and Jacob influenced Akhenaten to take on a monotheistic belief system?
I think it was a combination. I like to think of it, and I don't know for sure. I can't answer that for absolute certainty, but I like to think of it as a cooperative venture. That Akhenaten had, and the lineage of Akhenaten, his father and Amenhotep III and Tutmosis IV before them, had been moving towards the idea of one God. And I think Jacob is probably the thoughtful one, rather than Joseph. Jacob became a great friend of Akhenaten, and I think together they evolved this idea of monotheism, a joint effort, if you like. And there's an inscription in Amarna showing Joseph walking up to the altar. And he's dressed in foreign garb, and his leg is bandaged. And that reflects something in the Bible about him being chained in prison. And he's dressed in foreign garb. He's not an Egyptian. He's got a thin strip around his bald head. And that is an indicator of an Israelite, of a Hebrew. And all the other courtiers are dressed in Egyptian costume, but this leader of the procession up to the Aten, with Nefertiti and Akhenaten following. He's at the head of it, and I think that is Joseph. And he is, well, he's clearly a great administrator because he manages to get Egypt out of a problem situation when there's 7 years of famine, because he's thought about it and made them save the food in the 7 years of plenty. But Jacob is the philosophical one, who, I think, together with Akhenaten, evolves the idea of monotheism. You have a complete picture which fits together. Hello?
Yeah, Robert, I was just looking at the clock, and it's getting close to break time. So why don't we actually just go ahead and go to break now instead of delving into a new topic, because I think we're going to be changing directions.
All right,
okay?
we need to change direction and come out of Egypt now.
Well, yeah, so why don't we take a break, and we'll come out on the other side.
All right. Okay, Dr. Rita, thank you.
I'm Dr. Rita Louise. We're here talking to Robert Feather about his new book, Where Moses Stood. His webpage is robert-feather.com, and we'll be back after these words from our sponsor.
Just Energy Radio with your host, Dr. Rita Louise, will return right after these messages. And now back to Just Energy Radio with Dr. Rita Louise.
Hello and welcome back to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for staying tuned to the second hour of the show. We've been here talking with Robert Feather about his new book, Where Moses Stood, and we're going to be continuing our conversation with Moses, and we're going to be exiting Egypt, stage right, and moving into the Sinai Desert. Robert,
Yes.
Moses somehow gets the people released, and they make it through the Sea of Reeds, and now they're in the desert.
They're in the desert, yes.
And actually, let me ask this question, because it kind of ties to both the Egypt and the whole Sinai thing. But is there any, you talked about the Menenki.
Meneptah.
You know, they have to have easier names, these gods and kings. They need to be easier. You talked about that stone, and there actually being a textual reference to the Israelites. Is there any textual evidence or stories or anything to support Moses and the Exodus anywhere?
There is, and we're coming to it as we journey across the desert. We've left the Delta region, and as I think I mentioned, work by people like Hofmeyr and Bitek have shown that there was a kind of housing in the area of Pi Ramses, where they must have built stores and temples for Ramses, a kind of 4-bedroom house that crops up in Canaan 40 or 50 years later. And there are other things as well. The evidence for Moses is in the desert, and we'll come to that when we climb the mountain, when we take our shoes off and climb the holy mountain, which I'm almost certainly convinced is the correct mountain. There are a lot of other alternatives that have been proposed, but this is the true one. The skeptics, the so-called minimalists who downgrade the Bible and think that an awful lot of it was just made up, argue that the Bible talks about 605,000 people coming out of Egypt. They say that it's impossible for the desert to have sustained that number of people for 40 years. They say that there's a lack of any archaeological evidence in Sinai of the children of Israel, or the Israelites, and they say there's no evidence of Egypt in Hebrews in Egypt or Sinai or Canaan. Wrong, 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 wrong. First of all, they're taking the biblical number of 605,000 literally, which it just cannot be right. That's 605 males, which would have represented about 2.5 million people in total. Quite ludicrous. How they can even think that that could be a correct figure, I do not know. It's a mistranslation of the word Aleph, which is attached to the number. And you need to downgrade it by about 10% of that to something like 50 to 60,000 people coming out. Now, that makes it much more realistic for them to survive in the desert. And what needs to be taken into account also, that area is referred to as the Fertile Crescent, and at one time it was pretty fertile. That wasn't all desert as we know it now. And there was a dramatic change in weather conditions around about 1200 across most of the Middle East when drought set in. Before that, the Sinai could have sustained large numbers of people. So that's another myth that the skeptics have got wrong.
Well, didn't they find a whole city somewhere in the Sinai that was lost and under a bunch of sand, and it had a very large community?
That's right. That's right. And this is where we come now to the work that I've been doing. And the Sinai is a vast area, and the Egyptians controlled it. From very early times, from as early as 3000 BC, they controlled the whole of the area. In fact, they dominated most of the Middle East, the Canaan, the Levant, right up to the borders of Babylon and even Babylon. And they were mining in the Sinai at two main places. And this is probably the large conurbations that you're talking about. One at a place called Serabat Kadem, where they were mining turquoise, and another one at a place in the Araba, where they were mining copper. This was their main source of copper. And they had large numbers of people at these locations. So the desert could sustain large numbers of people, and had done for hundreds of years. So this idea that they couldn't have survived in the desert, there wasn't enough food or water or whatever, is wrong. So what happens, the Egyptians have dominated most of that region right up to the borders of the Euphrates. Then another power arises, the Hittites. The Hittites, coming from Anatolia, that sort of area, start encroaching on the Egyptian land and conquered areas, and they have a big battle at the Battle of Kadesh. I don't know if you saw the Ridley Scott film Exodus, Gods and Kings, but it starts off with a battle of Ramses II and Moses together fighting the Hittites at Kadesh. He has Moses as Egerton, who's Ramses II, as his brother, and Christian Bale plays the part of Moses. It's a great film, great sort of action scenes, but it gets so much wrong that you got to be very careful about taking it literally.
I love movies like that. I talk back to them. It's like, that's not how it is.
No.
Blah, 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 blah.
Well, anyway, it's got a lot right, but an awful lot wrong. I mean, it has Ramses II as the pharaoh of the pursuit, and he ends up on his own. All his people have been drowned in the Red Sea, apparently, and he's left alone, high and dry, washed up on the Red Sea, which is just unbelievable. So, where were we? We've got the likelihood of these mining camps now being vacated by the Egyptians, because after they have a battle with the Hittites in the north, round about 1250, 1260, they start to retreat. They start to pull back. And in fact, they start leaving the mining areas, and they start leaving Sinai actually pretty empty. So it's a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum, and it's an opportunistic time for the Israelites, the Hebrews, to come out of Egypt and come across the Sinai, because the Egyptians have relinquished control of it. And what do? They take over the mining camp areas, which are now vacant, and those areas can sustain a fairly large population.
Okay, couple of questions. So the battle you're talking about, is that the one that is immortalized on the one temple wall that they show Ramses is winning the war, but really it was kind of more a draw, and they came up with some kind of a compromise?
Yes. I mean, Egyptian records and inscriptions never show them being defeated. They only win. They only vanquish their enemies. But in this case, I think they get a bloody nose. They are actually frightened back into their borders of Egypt. They retreat right the way back to the borders of Egypt and leave Sinai vacant. Yes, that is the battle that's immortalized on the walls at Karnak. So you've got a very strange situation here. They've been mining at Serabat Kadem, the turquoise. They've been mining copper, and this is where it starts to get biblically interesting, very interesting, because the people they were using to do the mining for them were Midianites. And the Midianites were good at mining, good at metals. In fact, they had a group within the Midianite tribes called the Kenites, who were specialists in metals. And the Egyptians were using them as their work people at the copper mine. This has now been vacated. But where the Egyptians lived in that area, they erected shrines, and they erected one shrine at the base of a mountain where they worshipped a calf, Hathor, the goddess Hathor, which is a goddess of merriment and dancing and laughter. And it was a goddess designed, or they hoped, would protect the miners in their work. So now can you picture, we've got a mountain with a shrine and a temple area at the base of the mountain that the Egyptians have built for their goddess Hathor, a golden
You mean
cow.
kind of like a golden calf?
Well, yeah, it wouldn't be gold, but I mean, they actually, back in Egypt, they did have solid gold calves. That's probably the idea where that came from. And they have this temple area. It's sort of rectangular at the base of a mountain where they're doing all the copper mining. Now let's actually skip back a bit, because although we're homing in now on the true Mount Sinai, the Bible talks about the mountain where Moses received the Ten Commandments. It refers to it as Sinai, as Horeb. It goes under various names. It's never described in detail as to where it is. And a lot of people have conjectured that it's all sorts of places, the most popular being St. Catherine's monastery in southern Sinai, and that gets a lot of pilgrims. But that's only thought of as the place where the Ten Commandments were received, because Helena, Emperor Constantine's mother, in about 330 CE or AD, decided that was the place where Jesus had his transfiguration, where the Ten Commandments, where the burning bush was, and that mountain near to that monastery was the Mount Sinai. But it has nothing going for it. It's 7,500 foot high, which, when you think about it in terms of the biblical story, Moses goes up and down, carrying 2 large tablets. Quite impossible. I mean, in fact, even above 7,000 feet, you start getting altitude sickness. And this poor chap is supposed to be about 80 at that time. By the way, that's another reason why having Moses equating him with the Amana period means he would now be about 120. So quite impossible that theory about Moses was Akhenaten. There are all sorts of other mountains that have been suggested. There's one, another name for the holy mountain is Mount Seir, S-E-I-R, in the land of Edom. And a lot of people think that that is in Nabatea, which is now Petra in Jordan. But again, there's very little going for that. There's another one suggested in Saudi Arabia by 2 Americans, Bill Cornick and Larry Williams, claim that a mountain in Saudi Arabia was the true Mount Sinai. Again, when you analyze it carefully, it just doesn't work. There's a professor from a university in Italy, Emanuele Nati, who's been excavating for 25 years at a place called Har Kakom, and he thinks that is the place of Mount Sinai. But he's got no concrete evidence after 25 years. Sorry, I'm getting excited. That's what it is.
He's so excitable.
I know.
And this is going to sound like a really probably stupid question, but I think it's a good question. Mm-hmm. When I think of Egypt, or you see pictures of the Nile Valley, it looks pretty darn flat. There might be a sand dune over there. When you move into Sinai, everyone talks about all of these mountains. Is it really that mountainous or hilly in that region?
There are parts in the central which are very mountainous, and there are a line of mountains near the border with present-day Israel, which is quite mountainous. Yes, it's not flat.
Okay, because I've never been there, so
it's a treat to come. One day.
Why is it so challenging for people to figure out which mountain it would be? That's the part that it just flabbergasts me, that they keep saying it's this one, it's this one, it's this one.
That's right. Because they keep finding, they find some inscriptions. There's a lot of inscriptions over the Sinai. And they say because they seem to be Canaanite inscriptions, that this must be the place. Let's just deal with one final claimant, because there are dozens of mountains that are claimed to be the correct one. This is one that James Cameron, the filmmaker, cooperated with Simcha Jacobovici to decide that Hashem El Tarif was the correct mountain. Again, when you analyze it, it's got very little going for it. Okay, now let's get to the real mountain, because we've now got an altar at the base of a mountain that the Egyptians have erected an altar and probably a statue of Hathor, the cow goddess, in this temple area. And then they vacated. And the people who've been working there, the Midianites, take it over. And what do? This is where it gets really exciting.
They start mining again?
Well, they carry on mining, and that the copper is such a valuable commodity that they want to stay there and keep getting it. But what they do is they take over the temple and they convert it into a temple for the god that they worship. And guess what the god they worship is?
I'm going to guess Baal.
No.
Rats.
No, that's a good guess, actually. That is a good guess. No, it's a copper snake. They worship a copper snake. That is their god. And so they...
So does that tie into Moses with the staff with the snakes on it?
There are so many things now that we start finding that the Bible talks about that are actually evidenced on the ground at this place. And I don't know why.
But I thought that Moses married into the Midianite community. I thought his wife was a Midianite.
Yes, and I think that is the sort of Midianite factor that they bring into the story, because the Midianites are clearly there. And what must have happened? The Midianites are now in control of this copper mine. The Egyptians have gone back to their homeland. The Israelites coming out of Egypt, they now come to this place, and initially they must have had friendly relations with the Midianites. And that's probably reflected in Moses marrying a Midianite, Zipporah. But I don't know if that actually happened. I'm just curious, as that's a kind of embroidery. But there's no doubt that the Midianites were there, because we have examples of their pottery and their work. So that is absolutely correct. And the Bible talks about Midianites being associated with Moses. And there they are at this temple area. Now the Midianites, in worshipping their copper snake, they erect a tent over the altar area. They put a big tent covering over this rectangular area, which is probably, well, I've measured it exactly, and I know the dimensions of it. And that's another clincher in this catalogue of profound evidence that confirms this temple area in the Arabah at the copper mine was exactly the place described in the Bible. It measures about 34'9" by 29'6". That's measurements I've made with a handheld metric tape. And they put a big tent over part of this area. So now what happens? The Israelites had come along.
So, but is this tent, and I'm just maybe jumping ahead of the story, would that be like the same size as the tabernacle that the Israelites supposedly built?
You've jumped magnificently, Dr. Rita. You've jumped magnificently into a truth.
But that's really kind of scary, because while we were waiting for you to come back, I'm going on and on and on about, you read the Old Testament and they're building the tabernacle and you have to use this kind of fiber and it's got to be these colors with stripes and paisleys and these kind of clips and then they didn't even make it? What?
Well, they didn't make all of it. No, it's already there. It's the Midianite tent that they take over. They must have then ousted the Midianites at some stage, fell out with them, and the Bible kind of refers to that as them turning on the Midianites and destroying them at some stage, and that didn't happen completely. But it indicates the kind of change in relationships. One minute they're marrying, Moses is marrying a daughter of a Midianite priest, apparently. The next minute they're killing them. Weird, but there must be some kind of truth in them having good relations with the Midianites initially, and then falling out with them and evicting them from this temple area and taking over the copper mine.
I could think of a couple just right off the top of my head.
All right.
Well, but if you think about it, if Moses goes and gets the Ten Commandments and that whole thing, and now there is this revelation in belief, and they're saying this is the God, and the Midianites are going, we got a copper snake. Come on. I could see where it can create some contention between them.
Yes, and they fall out, and they get rid of the Midianites, and this is where it gets absolutely almost incredible and supernatural, if you like, because they take over this tent that the Midianites had erected, and they embellish it. They do what they normally do. They put beads on it and glittering stones. They enlarge it, but nevertheless, it's still basically the same tent that the Midianites had constructed, and it becomes the tabernacle. It becomes the tabernacle as described in Exodus. It becomes the tabernacle of Exodus 38. And most of the book of Exodus is taken up with describing the tabernacle. There's more description of the tabernacle than Solomon's temple. I'm very dubious about the actual accuracy of the description of Solomon's temple. But the description of the tabernacle fits on what we find at this site in the Arabah, at this temple site. And I'm now going to quote a series. I can't go through all of them, but I've got something like 18 different factors that are quite independent of my opinion that prove that this is the correct place where the Ten Commandments were received, that Moses was with his followers, that was the tabernacle and the shrine, and probably the Ark of the Covenant at this place, and the very mountain that Moses went up and received or wrote the Ten Commandments. The weird thing is that when these skeptics who said there's no archaeological remains in the Sinai make that kind of statement, they seem oblivious to someone called Benno Rothenberg and another person called Jonathan Glass and Nelson Gluck, an American who explored all over Sinai. And they found a huge amount of evidence of transitory people, such as the Midianites, the Amalekites, and the Israelites. And Benno Rothenberg, who's an archaeometallurgist, which is why I was interested in him, he explored intensely and wrote large volumes about all the finds and inscriptions across Sinai. And he describes this temple area in great detail. So really, this next series of, and I can't go through all 18 examples, I'll just give you a few of them. But that has nothing to do with me. This is what is actually on the ground in Sinai by this mountain, in the desert, by this copper mine. This is the actual remains that Benno Rothenberg writes about in his works, in his books. And you can see them online or buy his books, all detailed. And what I found as well, and then compare what the actual material and items and structures and remains on the ground are in terms of the biblical attestations. Completely independent of what I'm saying, but they prove, I think, what I'm claiming, that this is the exact mountain.
Okay, lay them on us, Robert.
Benno Rothenberg found the remains of a large linen tent with hangings and fine twined linen, and the colors were red and yellow linen fabric, which is exactly what the Bible says in Exodus 38, and the hanging for the gate of the court was needlework of blue and purple and scarlet, covering tents, rams' skins dyed red, and a covering of badgers' skins, which would have been yellow. So you've got red and yellow linen on this tent, which the Bible describes. And lo and behold, Benno Rothenberg found lots of the material at this site of red and yellow linen stacked up behind the shrine. This is where now we're in the realm of miracles, because some of this material is still with us. We still have some of the tabernacle, the holy tabernacle that Moses must have prayed in, and where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. We have pole sockets, which were holes for the poles that supported the tent. And the Bible says in Exodus 38 again, and their pillars were 4 and their sockets of brass 4. It describes the sockets. Mm-hmm. The wood, acacia wood, well, that's shittim in the Bible, and there is acacia wood at this Araba, and it's a certain kind of acacia. Copper snake. The Bible in Numbers 21:19 says Moses made a copper snake and set it on a pole to ward off poisonous serpents that were attacking the Israelites. That copper snake is in a museum in Israel. It still exists. We still have that copper snake. So the Bible is talking about a copper snake that actually did exist.
And that was found in that area?
In that area.
Mines? Okay.
They also, the Bible says, let's go the other way. Benno Rothenberg found a statue of Hathor, the cow goddess, and it had been defaced, just as the Bible said it would be. In Exodus 32, he said they have made a calf and worshipped it, and that's this golden calf that they're supposed to worship, and it's the cow god Hathor that the Bible is talking about. The Bible talks about 12 mazivot, standing stones. Guess what we found at this altar? 12
standing stones.
Yes. Offering basins, the shrine area. This is a clincher. This is absolute. I don't know if you can get any harder evidence than this. From Exodus 36, it describes the size of the altar area as 32 foot 6 inches by 30 feet. You have to just take the cubit as 51 centimeters and you come up with 32 foot 6 by 30 foot as the size of the altar that the Bible describes. When you measure it on the ground, and I measured it, it's 34 foot 9 by 29 foot 6. As opposed to 30 foot. It's almost exactly the same measurements.
So where I'm getting a little bit stuck, Robert, is when they left that area, because I do believe that, they didn't wander every day for 40 years, that they set up camps in some areas before they moved on again. But I was always under the belief that they took the tabernacle with them. But if you're finding cloth and you're finding poles and other things, it's sounding like maybe they didn't.
Well, I think there's more than one tabernacle in that sense. There was a tent, an erectable tent that they could take with them. And they must have taken that with them. And that's not the same one that's the remains are still there today, or not there today because they've been taken into museums. They didn't take that with them. They left that when they left. They left that shrine when they departed. Or I suppose the instructions of Moses, who's now been up the mountain, and this is a climbable mountain. It's not 7,500 foot high like St. Catherine's. It's very climbable. I've climbed it. And the weird thing is, when you're up on the platform overlooking a vast plain, and when I was there, I was sort of about 100 meters off looking up at this platform area on the mountain, and there was a party of Canadians who'd also climbed. So it's not that they didn't know what it was, but they went up there because it's an interesting place to go up. And this pastor who's leading this group is talking to them about the biblical story. And he's talking, not shouting, but I'm 100 meters away. I could hear every single word he was saying. So the actual audio conditions there are very peculiar, and you can hear from a long distance away. Now, then we have one more. I can't go through all the other things. The dimensions of the altar match. The presence of Midianites and Amalekites are described in the Bible, in Exodus 18 and Numbers 10. And Bene Rothenberg found residual pottery and remains evidencing the presence of Midianites and Amalekites, just as the Bible says. Smoke and fire. This is a weird one. This is
Smoke
really a
and
weird
fire.
one. Yes.
Okay.
The area is not volcanic. There are no volcanoes in Sinai. On the other side of Aqaba, on the Aqaba side of Jordan, there are. In Saudi Arabia, there are some active. But this was a center of copper smelting furnaces. And the Bible says now Mount Sinai was all smoke because the Eternal had come down upon a fire. The smoke rose up like a smoke of a furnace. Where are you going to get a furnace in the desert? Who's going to put a furnace? Except at this copper mining smelting area, there were furnaces. So when they talk about smoke and being guided by a column of smoke and the red flames coming up into the sky, this was the smelting activity at the copper mine that is being talked about. And the mountain at times must have been submerged in smoke from the smelting operation of the copper furnaces near the base of the mountain. Everything that the Bible talks about is there on the ground at this place. And there are many, many other things. One more quick thing. I don't know, how are we doing for time?
We're doing great. And I have a question, but go ahead. But then I have a question.
Okay. So what do we find above this altar area? On the slope where Moses must have stood to address the people below, and where he probably resided in a cave area which is up on that slope, 80 or 90 feet up the mountain. Tricky to climb in the old days when there weren't any paths, but there are now paths constructed, so it's not too difficult to get up to that area. The Egyptians, when they were there, had carved two figures high up on that mountain, and you can still see them in white etched carving on the front of that mountain. A figure of Ramses III paying obeisance to the goddess Hathor. And we know which is which because of the cartouches identified, and the hieroglyphics in those cartouches identifying Ramses III and Hathor as the goddess. They're facing each other, two huge figures carved onto the mountain. Underneath is a very rough inscription, which for some reason, well, I think I know the reason. Bene Rothenberg describes this picture of Hathor and Ramses III, but he doesn't read the inscription underneath correctly. He misses it, and probably because it's one of those inscriptions that unless the light is in the actual ideal angle, you don't see it. And a lot of tourists who come by there, and this group of pilgrims that I talked about earlier, Canadian I think they were, they didn't see this inscription because I spoke to one of them and they weren't aware of it. But it's there, and I could see it, and I read it, and the guidebooks know about it. They talk about it as being Egyptian hieroglyphics. It isn't. The moment I saw it, I knew it was not hieroglyphics. It's an early form of Hebrew, Sinaitic Hebrew. And what must have happened? The Hebrews
is it a real inscription, or is it some kind of, and I'm going to say, graffiti?
No, it's a proper inscription in a rectangular box. a long rectangular box. And Egyptians didn't put their inscriptions in boxes. They put them in cartouches in sort of oval shapes. And it's in Hebrew. And the guidebook for this area, and Benno Rothenberg translates it as something about a wine butler bringing wine to people. Well, that is completely out of context and doesn't make any sense. I tried to translate it myself, but I'm not an expert in Sinaitic inscriptions. So I consulted one of the world's top experts, a chap called Brian Collis at Massey University in New Zealand. And I sent him a photograph of it, and he was very excited because he'd not seen it before, and he'd studied Sinaitic inscriptions very closely. He runs a website called Cryptcracker, and you can go on and see what he does. He's the world expert on inscriptions in the Sinai. And after a few days, he came back to me, and he said, "Robert, I think I know what this is. And I'll have a first crack at it." And this is what he came up with. I'm not going to tell you all the details of the translation that he gave of this inscription, but it relates to Moses and it relates to the Arten. I don't think you can get any more conclusive evidence that the Israelites were here, that Moses was here. Why would they refer?
What did the inscription say?
I'm not going to tell you, Rita. I want people. I want people to look at the book now.
Okay.
Because
everything
I've talked about, I've spelled out in great detail with illustrations, lots of color illustrations, and I explain my references and back up all that I've said with, I believe, detailed, concrete evidence, and a translation of that inscription is included in the book. It's Brian Collis's translation. He's the one who did it, not me. But nevertheless, when he came back to me in an email with the words that he said he could see, I could not believe my eyes.
Did he know where you found it and kind of the background of it, or was it just a blind, here's this inscription, can you tell me what it says?
I did give him the setting of where it came from. He was not aware of it before, but he was, I can only say, very, very pleased to incorporate it into his complete catalogue of inscriptions. And I don't think he yet takes on board the full significance of it. I mean, one of the mysteries, Rita, is that this situation has been there since the 70s, since the 1970s, when Benno Rothenberg excavated here. The altar area that I've described, which is 34'9" by 29'6", matching the dimensions described in the Bible, was covered in a thick layer of sand. And he had to clear it and to get down to the outline of this shrine area.
How far is this copper mine from the turquoise mine? Are they in the same region, or are they far enough apart from each other that you wouldn't really call them close?
They're not close, no.
Okay.
But they're in the Sinai. The turquoise, Serabat el-Kadem, is further towards the center and a bit further north. The copper mine is near the borders of the Promised Land, just as the Talmud describes it will be. It says the mountain of the Lord will be near the borders of the Promised Land. It's in the right place. It also talks about the mountain towering over the shrine, and it does tower over. The shrine is actually inset underneath the mountain. And the Quran describes the shrine underneath the mountain. This fits. There's so many things that are exactly precisely as described in Holy Scripture. It cannot not be anything but the right place.
Okay, so here's my question. When they talk about making the Ark of the Covenant, when they talk about putting the tabernacle together, they talk about all kinds of gold and silver and copper and bronze. I mean, all of these metals that it's not just, a little bit. Were there, you're talking about a copper mine, but were they able to pull silver and or gold out of this mine as well?
No. And you have your exaggeration factor here. When they have a golden calf, it's highly unlikely that that actually exist. The calf that they're talking about is a stone calf, a cow goddess image that the Egyptians had left behind. They turn it into the idea of a golden calf that Aaron makes for the people while Moses is up the mountain, and they get restless. Makes a nice story, but it's just it's adapting a reality. The Ark of the Covenant is almost certainly very similar, if not the same one, as we see in the wall of Amarna, on a tomb wall in Amarna. We see a carrying cabinet which fits so closely the description of the Ark of the Covenant in the Bible that I'm inclined to think that it is one that was in existence at Akhenaten's capital city, and that his followers saved it when that city was destroyed. Within 20 years of Akhenaten disappearing, the priests from Thebes, they come back and they flatten Akhenaten, which is now known as Amarna. So it's now just a vast, open, empty plain. And also there's a carrying trunk in the tomb of Tutankhamun, which almost certainly is a pattern for the Ark of the Covenant described in the Hebrew Bible. What's inside is very intriguing. I think...
Well, that was my next question.
Okay, you're jumping ahead of me. You're always doing this, Rita. Dr.
Sorry.
Rita. You anticipate what's happening.
Well, this is so exciting because I'm psychic. I'm psychic.
You're an intuitive. It's true. Inside, the Bible talks about different things. The tablets of the law, the Ten Commandments carved on it. Some talk about the rod of Aaron. The broken tablets are also included in there. And the testimony. Now, what on earth is the testimony? The testimony.
No
and the
idea.
Hebrew word, well, that's a good query. I wonder what. The Hebrew word is adut for the testimony. And that's an Egyptian word. And it means scriptures gathered of wisdom through the history of Egypt. I think inside the Ark of the Covenant is a scroll with a testimony of other information, not just the Ten Commandments on tablets. Tablets, by the way, which must have been much smaller than we visualize them from the films we see of Charlton Heston with huge tablets in his arms. Almost certainly they are much smaller than that. But this scroll, I think, is also likely to have been in the Ark of the Covenant, and I think I know where that scroll is.
No way.
Yes.
Okay, dish it up, Robert. Dish it up.
It's in the book.
Oh, it's in the book. Oh.
I want to keep you on tenterhooks. But if I'm right, it's one of the most holy artifacts that we've ever discovered. And certainly for religious people, it changes the whole setting of their belief. It means that what the Bible is talking about actually is true and happened. And there are pieces of the tabernacle in the possession of the Israeli Antiquities Authority that are described in detail in the Bible. And there are things in the Ark of the Covenant that are still with us.
Okay, I'm looking at the clock. We have about 7 minutes, and we're talking about the Ark. And there is so much controversy about what happened to the Ark. I mean, you're talking about this tablet or this scroll. But what about the Ark itself? Have you come up with any new theory, or when you look at the different ones that are out there, are you drawn to one over another?
Well, there are Arks of the Covenant in almost every country in the world, from Africa to Australia. I mean, just incredible. None of them really have much credence, really. But I think the Ark of the Covenant is gone. If you want to see what it looked like, you have to look at the Tutankhamun carrying case in the Cairo Museum. That's what it looked like. Or this relief on a tomb at Amarna, in Merier's tomb at El Amarna. I show a picture of it in the book. That is probably as close as you'll ever get to seeing the Ark. But some of the Ark itself, the container, I think is gone, but some of the contents are still accessible. To summarize, what I hope I've done is confirm the route of the Exodus as described in the Bible. Now, it's not the exact route, because I can't be sure of that, but the 3 hinge points at the beginning, Pi-Ramses in Egypt, at this mountain where Moses collects the 10 Commandments, and the hill country of Canaan where the Israelites arrive. They are 3 fixed points, which you only need 3 points to get a route, and that is the route. Mm-hmm. This location would support a large population. It was a campsite. It was there ready for the Israelites to occupy.
Well, in your book, there was some comment which I was like, "Whoa, that's cool!" That there were actually like 12 different encampments that were found.
That's also true, and that may be the origins of the idea of 12 tribes of Israel, and the standing stones. 12 standing stones, they're there, as described in the Bible. The goddess Hathor, the remains of a cow, is still there, or at least in a museum now. But there was a defaced cow, the goddess Hathor, at this site. There's this Paleo-Hebrew inscription on the rock face, which refers to the Aton, which is Akhenaten's name for God. There's the copper snake, previously worshipped by the Midianites and then revered by Moses he actually put it on a pole, and it became worshipped later on until later in Israelite history they realized it was a pagan image and got rid of it. We've got this presence of skilled craftsmen, Kenites of the tribe of Midianites, able to make some of the tabernacle implements. We've got this strange, this is weird too. When I went up the mountain, I was wearing grey jeans. When I came down, the chap I was with and my wife said, "Your jeans have turned blue." They'd gone a blue-green color. But it was just an optical effect of the copper ore reflecting onto me. And that, the Bible talks about Moses coming down with a glow about his head. I think that's a reflection of some of the strange, quirky light phenomena that you get, and acoustic phenomena at this site.
Has anybody else identified this location? I remember watching one show that they were talking about that there was some kind of little shrine or temple thing on the top of the mountain, but it wasn't like, in my opinion, a real temple, not like what you're talking about. So you're the first one who's come up with this location.
And I don't know why, Dr. Rita, because it's there to see. All you have to do is put the pieces together. That's all I've done. But you need to be familiar with the work of Benno Rothenberg. He is the key to it. And perhaps because he's a metallurgist and of the same discipline as me, I got particularly interested in his work. And if you study what he spells it out. You might wonder, why didn't he connect this to the Bible? Well, there's a good question and a good reason, I think, why he didn't. He alludes to it. He says, in so many words, this seems to confirm the biblical story of the tabernacle built by the... But he won't go as far to say it is. He's very hesitant. And I think the reason is he was quite a strict Orthodox Jew. Came from a strictly Hasidic family, and the idea that this tabernacle was not a new construction that God had instructed Moses to build from as a pristine shrine, but the idea that it was secondhand, he didn't like to actually concede that it might just be the real tabernacle. I think that's the reason he, of all people, could have come to the same conclusions that I've come to, but he was reluctant to because of his religious beliefs.
This is fascinating work, Robert.
Thank you.
Fascinating. All right, I have 1 minute, and so now that you have made this discovery, does it make any changes in your investigation in the Copper Scrolls? And just a very quick answer.
In the Copper Scroll, not particularly, but it confirms that the Copper Scroll has taken us to Akhenaten. And the thread, it's following a thread all the way through from Qumran to Amarna and then back through Ramses, through the desert to this copper mine. Possibly the copper of the Copper Scroll, of the Dead Sea Scrolls, came from this area. It's quite possible. But the analysis that's been done on it has been pathetic. They won't let me have pieces of it to do my own analytical work on it. But it may well be the same source. But it all copper has been the key to my discovery, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. All right, Robert, if somebody wants to get a copy of your book, is it available in the U.S.?
It's on Amazon.com.
Okay, good.
It's on my website as well, which I think you gave out earlier in the program.
Robert-feather.com.
Yes. You'll be able to get it.
And so if they get it through your website, does it come autographed?
It could come more economic than Amazon as well. unless you're in Nova Scotia or somewhere, I don't know, because postage is enormously expensive. But certainly you'll get a favourable price, and it could have a signature too. Yes.
Woohoo! Well, that's priceless, Robert.
Well, I don't know about that.
It is. I'm telling you.
I bet someone's copying it already.
Robert, I am going to let you go. Thank you so much for coming on and spending time, and I can't wait for your next book to come out. Yay!
Thank you.
All right. You have a great morning.
I'm going to bed.
Okay. Bye, Robert.
Bye. Good night.
That's Robert Feather. His book is Where Moses Stood. His webpage is robert-feather.com. Next week, we have Douglas Dietrich coming on talking about World War II didn't end the way you think. Till next.
Join host Dr. Rita Louise each week at this time for Just Energy Radio. Point your browser to www